Today is Wednesday, September 2nd, and there are 62 days before the election, ladies, in case you're curious. So happy to have you join us tonight. As I had said in the email that went out originally, it's not often in life that we're given an opportunity to both travel back in time and move forward in the same endeavor. And so this should be a lot of fun, and we're so grateful to Pat for his time and spending with us and imparting knowledge and helping us adapt what we may have learned in St. Mary's however long ago to today's current world. It's such a blessing. Just some few housekeeping things. We had 42 RSVP, and as you had seen on the note, and not necessarily you had to RSVP to join us tonight, so that number may be even more. And so, and we have classes ranging anywhere from 1990, 1991, all the way up to current students of 2020. So given the size, Pat and I have talked about different formats that he would like for the sessions. And so for right now, just a few housekeeping. First, this is recorded. So Pat has his own YouTube channel. And so after we're done here, it will stop recording, and then he will be putting it up on his YouTube channel. How it's recorded is through the active speaker, which shared screens. So if you are not actively speaking, you're not being recorded, even if you can see everyone in the gallery speaking view, if you're familiar with Zoom. But if you do ask a question later and ask it personally, you will be recorded. And we're going to talk about questions in just a second. And then also, if you missed a session, this will be having them recorded. You'll be able to pop in later and see what may have been or what was spoken about during that time. And then if you have any particular issues about the recording or having even being recorded in general, just reach out to me or reach out to Pat directly, and we can talk about it. It's really no big deal. Everyone, as you can tell, we're all muted upon entry. And again, this is just for the size of the group at this point. But please ask questions, as Pat will talk about at the beginning. He very much wants to make this an engaging endeavor for all of us. And so you can ask questions in a couple of ways. First, as Pat is, providing his presentation or discussion, whatever it is, you can raise your hand. And so if you go to the bottom of your screen, regardless of what you're on, if you look around the participants section, there should be a raise the hand feature. And so you will be digitally raising your hand. I will be able to see it. And I'm going to be monitoring the appropriate time, more or less, to kind of jump in and say, hey, so-and-so has a question. At that point, I will unmute you, and then you can ask the question directly. If you wish for me to ask the question, just simply type it in the chat box, and either when the time is right or at the very end when we have time for questions, I will read your question. Or if you can't find the raise the hand feature, there are always the reaction buttons. And so if you click on a reaction, you can applause or give a thumbs up. If you give a thumbs up, I'll know that that's your digital raise the hand, and I certainly will call on you when the time is right. So. And then lastly, Pat will explain in the beginning, he wanted to make sure to get your thoughts on not only the material that's covered, but also the format that we have put together here. And so after the conclusion of tonight's discussion, you will receive a questionnaire with 4 questions, just asking you your thoughts on both the material that's presented and the format. We're happy to make any changes. This is obviously new for all of us. It was a crazy idea I had about 11:30 p.m. while washing dishes, while everybody was in bed. And I was just thinking about the world today and how I wish sometimes you could go back to St. Mary's and take those classes and take advantage of their, and apply it to your life. And so thank you all for your, humoring this crazy endeavor, and of course to Pat. For doing so as well. And that's all the housekeeping I have. I'm going to be on mute as well, so the full recording can go on to Pat. And unless anybody has any questions, of which you can type into the question box, Pat, I will send it on over to you.
Cool. I cannot tell you how nice it is to sort of see you again. It's not really like the real thing, but it's still delightful. We lost Reunion last year, and so there were a whole bunch of alums who are coming back. I was looking forward to seeing them. I love doing the presentation at Reunion, just because when alums come back, um, one, they're paying way more attention than students do. And they're much more assertive. And that's kind of what I want to capture from you folks. I want you to be more assertive in this process. I don't want this to be just a lecture kind of thing. If that was the case, I could record sessions, put them on YouTube, and we'd be done. I'm doing that not just because I enjoy discussion, but it's out of respect for the expertise and experience that a lot of you have developed over time in lots of different capacities. It's always, oh my God, I was just flashing on the old budgetary process. That's how sick this is. It's always irrational to throw away information. I kind of wish I could gotten a show of hands how many people remembered that from the class, but it would be irrational for me to disregard the vast storehouse of expertise that's that's sitting out there. So hopefully that kind of gives you an idea how I would like this to go, and hopefully you can enjoy it as well. So let me go over the overall structure of what we're doing here, particularly because there are some folks who graduated or came here after the public policy course was no longer required. I switched over from teaching public policy as a required course to research methods as a required course for a whole bunch of reasons you don't need to know about. So some of you were political science majors, but didn't take the public policy course. And there are some folks who weren't who weren't political science majors either. So I'm hoping that the veterans will suffer me doing a little bit of background stuff just to get everybody up to speed. I promise I'll be quick with it, but certainly rookies, if I'm using terminology, if I'm saying stuff that doesn't make any sense, that would be an appropriate time to raise your hand, do something to get Michelle's attention. And that would be one of those things I'd want to address right away, because I don't want to leave you in the dust and just move on. And okay. Okay, so the overall structure of this is to seeing the public policy process as actually consisting of 3 stages. Agenda setting, the policy process as ordinary humans think of it, and then implementation. Agenda setting is how certain issues show up on the agenda. I'm going to clarify that again in a minute. The public policy process concerns how political institutions deal with the making of public policy, and implementation concerns how bureaucrats put those policies into effect. Okay? Does that make sense, y'all? So I'm kind of covering the same ground as the old course, but I want us collectively to think about how we perhaps need to change the theory that I developed for that course. My confession is I put that theory together. There were bits and pieces from various places, but I kind of put it all together, and I liked its coherence. But increasingly, I found when I was teaching the class, I didn't find it satisfying. And I sometimes felt like I was cheating students, like that something needed to be done. There wasn't any literature out there that would help. And I just didn't have the opportunity to do the wholesale revision of that. that's the intellectual part of this that I think will be fun for all of us, is seeing if a new theory needs to be developed, if we're just kind of tinkering with the old theory. So I'm going to give you the my word for the day, because I did this every once in a while, and that's architectonic. We're looking to develop an architectonic vision. If you think about architecture as having an overall structure, that's what we want to move toward in terms of the policy process. Okay. It should be clear from that this is straight up analytical. There's nothing partisan or ideological about it. There aren't Republican theories of the policy process, or Democratic theories, or liberal theories, or Democratic socialist theories. You're just trying to understand why things work the way they do. Okay? And that's what we want to do. I will say, however, that I haven't given up my obsession with democratic rule. So that's going to be the guiding norm going through the process. You had to suffer through it while you were an undergraduate. You're going to have to suffer through it now. Okay. All right. So let's start out with agenda setting. The importance of agenda setting, some of this is just for new folks. When I was an undergraduate, there was no field of agenda setting. Nobody recognized the importance of agenda setting. I ended up taking an entire seminar as a graduate student just on agenda setting, as people began to understand the importance of that. And my graduate mentor, my dissertation advisor's phrase that he always used to love using was from Victor Hugo. There's no idea more powerful than an idea. There's nothing so powerful as an idea whose time has come. And in a concrete way, you can see this now, right? There are plenty of things that haven't been receiving much attention, and then all of a sudden they're getting a great deal. So, shooting of George Floyd, boom, it put police reform right on the agenda. It was something that people talked about, believed that that government and officials ought to do something about. And that's kind of the nature of the agenda. People's beliefs about which issues ought to be addressed. It's not necessarily what should be done about that issue, but it's we ought to do something about this issue. And because I think it's often helpful to flip this around, I think it's a really good exercise for you to think about issues that you think are important, and yet nobody recognizes they're important. Okay? In other words, it's not, the idea's time has come. The idea's time hasn't come, but it's still a good idea. It's something that you see as a crushing need for society or the economy, and yet we're not dealing with it. Those are the kinds of things that can help you appreciate the importance of agenda setting. Like, if you have one of those things, well, how do I get it on the agenda? If you think it's that important, then by God, you should want government to do something about it. Strategically, how can you go about doing that? Okay? All right, quick. 2 old definitions. We identified 2 levels of the agenda. One level was called the informal or systemic agenda. And the informal or systemic agenda was the collection of issues that a substantial proportion of the public believes ought to be addressed. Okay? And that can include ordinary citizens, interest groups, journalists, anybody. Okay? That's the informal or systemic. The other level is the formal or institutional agenda. And the formal or institutional agenda is the set of issues that's being considered by governmental institutions. You do your three branches, right? there's a case on the docket for the courts. There's a bill in Congress, right? Or there's a president speaking about it, okay? Those two different levels of the agenda. This is particularly one of those points where if that doesn't make sense for rookies, give Michelle a yell, okay? My approach there placed a large emphasis on ordinary citizens, because if you could get a large body of the citizenry believing that an issue ought to be addressed, that could place pressure on public officials, particularly elected public officials, to put it on the formal or institutional agenda. So you could see a flow of ideas and issues percolating up from ordinary citizens, interest groups, journalists, to members of Congress, bureaucrats, cases on the court, okay? That meant we should really pay attention to understanding the nature of the mass public. What are ordinary citizens like, okay? And I operate under no illusions. This may be the most memorable part of the public policy course. Depending upon your age, you remember or don't remember Ally McBeal. Okay, the little, it was played by Peter McNichol. This little mousy guy, and he would get to a certain point in the case, and he would say it with me, and then do the punchline. Well, so on this line, I feel like I should say it with me if everybody's mics were on, and you would say, the mass public is stupid. That would have been like the major takeaway from public policy. I kid, but it's so easy for us to forget the depth of that. You and I, for the most part, associate with relatively well-educated individuals. You don't, I could probably get a show of hands on how many went to the Sturgis bike rally. In the Dakotas, not many people went. Well, if you went to things like that, you would come into contact with lots of ordinary citizens who aren't like us at all. If you attended here long enough ago, then you remember the agenda setting survey. And that was designed to give students a taste of what ordinary citizens were really like. It was a really short survey, got some demographic information about folks. It also asked, what do you think is, I'm sorry, I stole the question from Gallup, all right? What do you think is the most important problem facing the nation? What do you think ought to be done about that? And then the same two questions asked pertaining to the state, okay? Those were hilarious. Those responses were often hilarious. You would have plenty of ordinary citizens who had no idea that the crack in their sidewalk was not a matter for Congress to address, who just had no idea about what was going on, matters of jurisdiction, you name it. They didn't know those things. That was a really helpful thing to kind of put under your belt and go, okay, the bulk of the citizens in the United States, they were going to be like that. They were not going to be like you. when we looked at that and students got a sense of how lacking in particularly political knowledge ordinary citizens are, like give them a break. They have more important things to do than follow politics. That means you couldn't motivate them with what we came to call material presentations. If you wanted to, that idea that I talked about, idea you have and you think should be addressed in politics, and you want to recruit citizens as an audience, get them engaged so that they're going to support your idea, using a material presentation which would have facts, details, figures, jargon, really detailed, specific kind of language, you would obviously fail. You were fitting a square peg in a round hole. All of that information, the phrase that came to mind, you'd be waltzing before a blind audience. It wouldn't do you any good at all. But there's another motivating force, and that's emotion. Everybody has emotions. You don't have to have any knowledge. You don't have to have anything. Everybody has some sort of emotional response. So if you can tap those emotions, then you can get them involved. Then you can get them recruited to support your cause. In the phrase the concept that I used was, you can get them in the scope of involvement, okay? That range of folks who are interested and believe that's an important issue. Well, those emotional appeals we called symbolic. And symbols are simply anything, words, pictures, music, anything that will evoke an emotional response. Okay, so given the nature of ordinary citizens, you need symbols to get them into the scope of involvement, right? So I'm going to go back to the very beginning. You want to get them on board with that issue for the informal or systemic agenda. Your means to get them there has to be emotional appeals. The factual, jargon-based material appeals will not work. They will not be effective, okay? And in fact, if you think about a number of issues that have leaped onto the systemic agenda, like police reform, like gay rights and gay marriage, those didn't leap onto the agenda because people reasoned their way into their involvement, okay? There were principles and values and things that people responded to emotionally that brought them in, okay? All good? All right. By the way, I'm attempting to kind of do this relatively quickly. I want to leave a really big block at the end to start tossing around stuff with you. Okay. All right. So that's the kind of process. You could then, with symbols, move it to the informal agenda. You could put pressure for it to then move to the formal or institutional agenda. Now, there were additional elements, and in the next class or so, I want to get into these in more depth, but I'm just going to kind of throw them out there just so you have them as place markers. We talked about the role of crises as providing a real opportunity for issue entrepreneurs are the folks who try to market those ideas, okay, to get people into that scope of involvement, whether it's on the informal systemic level or up on the institutional formal level. Crises are simply a great opportunity for issue entrepreneurs to get their issue on the agenda. After all, if it's a crisis, it probably affects people's emotions, okay? Some of you may remember I even offered an opportunity, offered a story about student protest back when I was in college, and there were student organizers who would they would like provoke cops into responding, you know, because they knew as soon as that came back, you would have cops beating up college students. And, you know, college students are just endearing, nice. So you could get that kind of, you get the kind of emotional response. So crises, that's another element that's there. And also the matter of legitimacy. Issue legitimacy and group legitimacy. We're going to do more about this later, but it's basically whether you're, think of legitimacy, a synonym being respectability. Okay, if your issue or your group is more respectable, you should have an easier time getting things on the agenda. Okay, so the perfect recipe is there's a crisis. You're speaking on behalf of a group that's regarded as very legitimate. Okay, and you've come up with a way of dealing with that that's not all that different from what we've been doing before. That's relatively closely tied to the status quo. You're not asking for a big change, okay? We're going to come back to these later, but I wanted to set those out just so you had a more holistic sense of this. But now I want to get back to the core of this, and that's when I can kind of open this up a little bit. I'll also tempt fate because I'm going to share screen in a minute. So we'll see how that goes. And that has to do with the lack of political information and knowledge on the part of ordinary citizens. Okay? Now, it's not as though ordinary citizens I knew it. My best friend jumps in here. It's not as though ordinary citizens have recently gotten smarter, right? I think it's sad I can't hear everybody laughing, but you get it, right? But here's the interesting question. Do you think they've become more ignorant? Okay, and I think a lot of folks would say yes, and that's partly y'all are getting old because that's what old people think. But here's the other part. Information sources have changed, and the traditional media that would undergird that old system has become not terribly relevant. Certainly when I would talk to my students here over the last like 10, 15 years, they didn't read the damn New York Times. You know, they didn't read newspapers. They didn't watch network news. They would be getting news items via Facebook. They would be, you know, it was through social media, okay? And that raft of cable TV channels has come on the scene as well. Again, entirely different, okay? So what has that meant? Okay, here we go. We're going to trip the light fantastic. Everybody ready? Okay, everybody see it? Okay. This is a study done pertaining to, well, you can get the title, Misperceptions, the Media, and the Iraq War. This is a center that's based at University of Maryland, and they were interested in studying the phenomenon that occurred pertaining to the Iraq War if you remember or you know about it, the Bush administration offered a number of reasons why we needed to invade Iraq. And they made a number of claims about what was going on in Iraq and the relationship between Iraq and Al-Qaeda, you name it, okay? Virtually none of those ended up being true, okay? And yet, it seemed as though folks continued to believe those things were true, even after, if you looked at reliable news sources, they had debunked all of those things, okay? So here we go. Let's see if we can get to the right page here. I'm sorry, let me kind of go back for a second there. In some sense, when you went beyond, the three major networks, your local paper, and all of a sudden you have this wealth of sources of information, it's not unreasonable to say, well, gosh, you have a lot more sources of information, they're competing with each other. And so each one of them would want to kind of fill in the gaps that the other one had missed. So there's a possibility with all of those sources of media, you could have had an increase in information and knowledge that was out there, but not quite. Okay. So here's the first thing that I wanted to show you. For starters, there were three informational items that they used in their index. 30% of the public had no misinformation. I'm sorry, I'm going to change the language there. They use misperceptions. It's misinformation. You're not perceiving stuff. You're believing that things are true that aren't. I would like to slap them around a little bit because you're reducing the seriousness of the problem when you just say misperception, okay? You're going to find we have tons of these folks who believe they know things that simply aren't true, okay? You had 60% of the public who had one or more misperceptions, and you had 10% who were wrong on everything, okay? This was not distributed evenly. Okay, is that it? There we go, that's what we want. Here we go, frequency of misperceptions. Same three items, okay? And this is respondents with one or more misperceptions. Do I need to increase the size of this or is it big enough for everybody? Okay. Leading the hit parade is Fox News. 80% of folks who relied on Fox News had at least one misperception. On the other end, I want you now to get out your damn checkbooks and start writing a check to PBS and NPR because they're down here with the lowest rate of misinformation, okay? So the media folks consume makes a difference, okay? There are 2 points, 2 additional points here. One, it's a little disturbing that CBS isn't that far behind. And it's not surprising that print media is down here really low. What I want to point out is that it is not simply the content of each one of these media outlets. It's also how people consume that media outlet. Okay? So Michelle had, well, actually, Sister Amy had posted this thing on sort of rating the media in terms of whether they're liberal or conservative. It's only part of the picture. You can have conservative media, but if people consume that conservative medium differently than another conservative medium, you could have a different outcome in terms of the levels of misinformation, okay? Or conversely, level of knowledge. It makes a difference. So clearly the way that people consume print media and PBS and NPR is different, and the content's probably different, radically different from Fox News, okay? And another part of this, oh crud, I left one thing out. Fox News and CBS and ABC and NBC and CNN don't do research like print media. I just gone through an article in the Washington Post, and they have gotten, as the media have become attacked, they now pretty routinely put in a little paragraph that says, this article is based on interviews with, and it was like 28 administration officials, da 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 da. Do you think Fox News interviews 28? Do you think CBS News interviews 28? Print media just takes the time to do that research, okay? But this real problem then becomes, and I can stop sharing this now. There we go. We're back. Everything cool?
Yes, and I have a question when you're ready.
Let her rip, man.
Anne Rucker O'Connor wants to know, she says, it makes sense. How would this change now in 17 years since this was published? How has this changed or remained the same? I think PBS and NPR have changed in how it reports in recent years.
And, oh, damn, you guys are good. Yeah, there are both market and political forces at play here. And let me do something else before I get to exactly where Anne was coming from. One of the reasons CBS is so close is that Fox News has been increasing its market share. And that influences the traditional network outlets that have been losing audience share to start mimicking what Fox is doing. So you're getting much more dramatic, much more dramatic, and this has been happening for a while. Resources at the networks got shifted from archive and research into like graphics. I mean, this has been going, and you're right, it's been going on for a long time. I mean, this was happening back in the 80s, but it's just continued to accelerate. So you've been gutting traditional news organizations. They don't have the kind of staff they used to have. They can't do the work they used to do. They moved the news division into entertainment. All of those things just make it worse. You're simply not, you're not doing the work that professional journalists used to do. And about the only place that you see that really upheld is in print media, major print newspapers. But let me get to Anne's. In addition to the market forces, there are political forces. And I mean, what's been happening over time is that conservatives have been much more vociferous about claiming there's bias in the media. And, you know, PBS and NPR are dependent upon government spending. And so they have to guard against the appearance of being biased one way or the other. So then they have to do a more exaggerated version of the balance that traditional journalism did, just to make absolutely certain they've guarded against that appearance of being biased. Even in, some of you may remember this, there are so many stories where honestly there aren't two sides. There just aren't. The little anecdote I used to tell folks locally was there was an organization called Fair Tax in South Bend. And you know, Indiana doesn't tax much at all. And we have the expected service as a result of that, educational system, you name it. But the sentiment is so opposed to any kind of increased taxes that you have this organization called, I don't think it exists anymore, but it's called Fair Tax. Truth in advertising applied, it would be no tax. That was what they were arguing for. I knew these people, they were like certifiable. They had no understanding of what was going on. But the local newspaper, again, lacking resources, but needing to demonstrate balance, would always interview the crazy woman who ran Fair Tax. Well, that's the bind that NPR and PBS find themselves in right now. It's not because of professional norms of journalism, it's because they're under attack. And so it's a political thing rather than a professional norm thing. And does that make sense, Anne? Okay. Was there anything else?
Yes, as I started talking, I need to unmute myself.
Okay.
There is quite a discussion going on now. If you don't mind, I will just read some of the comments that people have in response, and you might even want to grab a pen or paper and kind of write down some thoughts of how you would respond. So Natalie O'Donnell Wood said, yeah, I'm curious about print media too. In my backyard, our major newspapers have been hollowed out by hedge funds ownership. And then Therese Vogel says, I think the media itself, especially television, has totally changed to be more of what it was prior to journalism, wanting to be more about reporting what happened, similar to the American Revolution versus the 50s, 70s call to journalistic integrity. All the news channels are just people sitting around discussing their opinions, and unfortunately, most people take that as fact. Maureen Russell then says, 5-page intel analysis has turned into 4-minute videos. It's a sign of the time. And then Jennifer Odell says, I also think that there has been a
confluence?
Oh my gosh, I can't say that
Consolidation.
word. Consolidation, oh my goodness, of local TV stations. Oh my goodness. Sinclair, for example, that has to be contributed to bias for sure. And then Hannah says, do we get to put part of the blame on that reactive / theatric shift and lack of deep research on 24-hour news cycles? And Therese says, exactly, Maureen, and people won't even need to read that headline anymore. Megan says, but even print media has pressure to get stuff out on social media. It is better, but they aren't immune to pressure. And then lastly, I'll put in here, Leslie says, I believe Pew Charitable Trust has done a more recent analysis on news sources and knowledge of current events. And I believe Fox is still worse than NPR / PBS.
Yeah.
So how would you like to follow up with that?
Okay.
There's more here if you want me to keep going.
Well, let me hit these, and then there's a kind of an opportunity. I'm almost at the point where I kind of hand it over to you folks.
Great.
And we run with that. There's a lot going on there. I'll take the low-hanging fruit first. Okay? Absolutely, the 24-hour news cycle means folks aren't doing all of that research. They're, you know, they can't. They have to get something out really quickly, and that's one of the major sins of cable news, right? Because they're doing just, you know, you get CNN, it's just cranking stuff out all the time. They're not doing any kind of research. It's just like whatever hits and sticks on the wall, they run with, and that's true of pretty much all the cable news stations. So that's an easy one. Yeah, that exacerbates it, and that makes it even worse. I'm not sure I understood one of them, but I think it has to do with a blurring of the line between editorials and news. And again, I just, I have, some of you know this, I have really, really elderly neighbors that I sort of go over, and my wife and I try to take care. He's like 92 years old. Well, you know what they watch. I mean, I've told them I don't watch any cable news. I don't care what it is. I find it completely useless, and I won't watch it. But when I'm over there, I get to see what they're seeing and what cable TV news watchers see. And there is this incredibly blurry line between editorializing and stuff that purports to be news. And I, again, I don't consume that stuff very much. And so I'm open to you guys, you know, dope slapping me and saying, no, that's not true. But my bet is that that occurs on all those cable stations, that there's that blurring of the line. And you know what, there's another place where the line blurs that just occurred to me. And that's when people get their news items on, say, Facebook. It won't distinguish between things that are editorials and things that are news items. And folks will respond to the editorials as though they're news. There was, I hate to say this, but there was a former student of mine who just posted a thing on Facebook like it was news about what was going on in the Virginia State Legislature. And it took every fiber of my being to just respond back. That's not a news item. This is an interested party who's foaming at the mouth about this issue. It's not even correct. There are factually incorrect things there, but because they got it through that avenue, rather than just cracking open the newspaper where you would have clearly identifiable news sections, editorial sections, opinion sections, it's all sort of spread out there in an indistinct way. And that blurs the line as well, okay? And the stuff about, I think when I talk about newspapers, at this point, I'm really just talking about like major, really national newspapers. There's local newspapers have real value, and it's a crime that they are running out of resources. They're just dying. They provide an incredibly important purpose for local communities, but the day is long past that they did any researching. I mean, the South Bend Tribune, I don't know that they do any important news stories using their staff. They just pull from AP, USA Today, they just pull all that stuff and then throw it on the page. And that's really, really sad. So it's really only the major news organizations. Let me make this not quite so dismal. There are also really awesome news gathering organizations that are out on the web that are hiring. I think because newspapers are going in the dirt, they're able to hire really good journalists who used to work at the Times or the Post or LA Times, or okay. and they're doing good work, but you have to hunt around to find them. And certainly those ordinary citizens we're talking about, they're never going to find them. They're never going to find those news sources. So how's that sound?
That's great. And if anybody has a follow-up, they can raise their hand or chat. I will let you know too that I've just saved the chat. So for those that are putting questions out or different thoughts, I will be giving this to Pat after it's concluded so he can see kind of your thought process, how are you responding to various points, et cetera. There's a discussion about nonprofit journalism and alternative news outlets like podcasts, cell phone news.
Yeah.
And then I want to read a quick part and then after that move to Kate's point about experts. So there was a point here, Polly says, has there been, in addition to the conversation about nonprofit journalism and alternative news outlets, she said, I'll add to your question, has there been a shift away from news outlets getting direct insight from experts? There appears to be a rejection of expertise, and some of that seems to come from not interviewing scholars, scientists, economists, experts across industries with authoritative evidence-based insight. And Kate adds that, I guess to that point, she said that a lot of the experts are actually those folks from PR firms. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. I think this is where partisan polarization just makes everything worse. There used to be a whole bunch of research institutes and organizations and foundations that did good, solid work. They may have had a conservative bent or a liberal bent. But it's been lost at a number of those organizations. But those organizations continue to have folks who get identified as experts. As opposed to getting folks who are more likely, you know, academics, disinterested, we haven't been bought off yet. So I think there's been a shift that way. Probably the more important shift, however, just has to do with the general discrediting of those traditional news sources and experts. And certainly, I mean, that you can kind of see this with the apocalypse that we're all living through, right? Is that you consistently find experts getting challenged by folks who clearly don't have expertise. And this will go back to that matter I mentioned about consumption. That changes the way that ordinary citizens consume that information. And I think that's probably the bigger problem, is when you have discredited expertise. In a sense, it doesn't matter if you bring experts on. They're not going to be believed. Yeah, I think I'll leave it at that. And was there another thing there to?
No, does anybody want to pop on and ask a question specifically or a follow-up? I'm certainly happy to unmute you.
I tell you what, let me sort of wrap this thing up with the open-ended question I want to ask all of you to run with. I think we could kind of all agree on that being the situation, right? In terms of the changed media situation has had an impact on the way that ordinary citizens perceive what's going on, what they believe to be true. And I want to give you kind of a general statement about that, okay? So in the past, if you were an issue entrepreneur and you wanted to get folks involved, you wanted to get them on board with your issue, you'd use a symbolic presentation. You understand they don't really follow politics, they don't know that much, but you can get them angry or inspired, something about your issue. But there were guardrails, okay? And the guardrails came from the existence of that traditional media. Wasn't perfect, Lord knows. Those of you who took mass media and public opinion with me before all this got started, they were a real punching bag for me then. But compared to what people are consuming now, it did set some limits on what you could do. What strikes me, and I want to see what you all think, what strikes me is that now the guardrails are off. So if you're an issue entrepreneur, you can use whatever symbols you want. They could have absolutely no factual connection to the issue that you're addressing. And I think you could get away with it. You could then move things on the agenda, keep things off the agenda for reasons that are totally bogus because those guardrails are gone. Okay, and you can always, particularly if you're strategic, you take a look at those alternative sources of information that are out there. And if you have someone who's going to support the direction that you want to go, you don't have to worry about the facts, about what's really going on. All you have to do is get them on your side to carry those symbols out, broadcast them, and you're off to the races. Yeah, I get it. It's kind of an apocalyptic vision, but we're kind of in the apocalypse. So I figured, what the heck? So that was kind of what I wanted to open up to folks. I don't know the best way to do this, but what sorts of things are occurring to you about how that changed media environment changes agenda setting? That's like just in case you didn't notice, that's like the big question for the class.
It is 9 o'clock on the dot. If anybody wants to just unmute themselves and ask their question, they can feel free to do so, or to follow up with Pat's question. We've got, if anybody's going to take it.
Okay, can I go?
Go ahead, Hannah.
All right. So in what sense of, at what risk do we have of that affecting policy, right? So everything's very emotional and almost a little bit manipulative, because if you're just playing on emotions and getting things on an agenda, but
you're being kind.
but how much does that put legitimate policy at risk? Because if the narrative is always changing, how do you actually seek to get good policy out of the agenda?
Yeah. You're looking ahead to the policy process, so you're kind of cheating, Hannah. But that's okay. Let me. I think that it certainly means. I like your idea, or your description of what's coming out of the public being more erratic, and I think that's true in a number of ways, and it also captures that the rhythm of you've got a 24-hour news cycle, right? And things come and they go and they come and they go. I think it becomes difficult then to sustain. I'm going to stick with agenda setting right now, but to sustain that involvement for a period of time where you can move it through the agenda setting process and get it addressed in terms of public policy. And I'm just going to use the policing reform right now because it's like that's what we're living through, right? In spite of the fact that like you can't look left or right without seeing Black Lives Matter is showing, I'm sorry, I'm a sports fan. So like, you know, all the, all the NBA players, everybody's got Black Lives Matter, you know, it's painted on streets. It's like all over the place. It's not as though there have been that many policy changes. And policy's hard. I think, you know, that's part of where you're coming from. And to get that done, that means you're going to have that sustained push. And I will sneak ahead a little bit. If that's going into the meat grinder of partisan polarization in our political institutions, well, yeah, that's not a recipe for good policy making. It's just not. You need to have basic agreement on the information and sustained attention on the issue, and then the kind of negotiation and compromise that, you know, you used to get between the parties.
And Pat, I would say we don't have that at the national level. It's almost completely broken.
Yeah,
is my observation. And I look back, you know, I graduated in '88, and you know, you used to, like, I'm thinking in the '90s. I mean, used to see legislation, used to see issues come to the fore. They would actually work on legislation. They would come together. There's no legislating going on at the national. I mean, there's some things going on at state and local levels.
Yeah.
But virtually, there's very little other than the people who are contributing to campaigns, voting themselves resources and money.
Right.
Right. But there is none. There is no national policymaking. Is where I am because it's for a variety of reasons, many of which you've talked about here, involving, you know, the media. You know, people have the attention span of a gnat, and then, you know, it's my view, it's completely broken.
Yeah.
Maureen Russell wants to jump in too.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I wholeheartedly agree with that statement, and I've, as a contractor, supported the State Department, the Defense Department, and Homeland Security over the past 14 years, and it's been, you know, when I was at State, working on providing unclassified assessments to private sector companies, NGOs, even like Notre Dame, as they sent students to Haiti before, those kinds of assessments, and it was a really detailed process, even though a lot of my sources were emails from embassies and consulates that were unclassified, the New York Times, things like the Open Source Center, which is part of the US government. And it would take forever, and the private sector would always complain. And then when you get to DOD, and it's its own meat grinder, I was supporting you know, the DOD's relationship with Mexico, and people within policy would just fight over even resource documents to a policy memo. So like that even slowed down more. And then when you got the DHS, well, there's nothing going on, right? I was just there as of 2019, and they couldn't understand that half this, you know, all the acronyms included the word customs, and they had no idea that DHS had anything to do with international trade. So these are all kinds of things where, you know, it would be this heat of the moment response. Every agency's process is very slow. And so you always have this conflict of like, why isn't the senior leader being informed fast enough? And then they kept coming up with their own like little, like, what they call them, commander action groups. They're inner circles, thicker and thicker, and providing specific voices as opposed to running through the traps. So it's affecting it that way. And it's not as well balanced as it should be. And my comment earlier was like, I saw presidential daily briefings from the intel community go from 5 pages to 2 pages to like 2-minute videos that like basically cribbed Marvel movies.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. I mean,
shocking.
On the difference as you move, what one dimension is over time, and one is in terms of federalism from national to state to local, and it's the, you know, the demon is partisan polarization, right? So over time you saw partisan polarization kind of infect a greater number of issues. I don't know whether folks have noticed it, but originally it was a relatively small number of issues that fed into the kind of ideological divide that developed between the two parties. And then all sorts of things that you wouldn't have thought were ideological got fed into that. The reductio ad absurdum is masks. it's not ideology, but it got fed into ideology. So at the national level, over time, partisan polarization just kept eating up more and more of the agenda. And then it's been sort of percolating down to the state level. It's not at the same level as it is at the national level, but it's not great for lots of states. And it's even getting down to some local governments. That's something that, if you want good policymaking, that has to get reduced. It just has to. There's no way to get around it. Otherwise, you govern through elections, and that's no way to govern, because you don't. Again, you're throwing away information. Folks like Maureen, like Anne, who been developing expertise and information for policymakers, and then when they say, "I don't care," that's insane. That's just insane.
I can't wait for you to see the chat. It's all over. It's
That
wonderful.
sounded-
And you're getting a good sense too of the wealth of knowledge, as you had rightly said, that this group brings to the table in a variety of experiences, especially professionally. So it'll be great to pick this back up at our next session for sure.
So I want to leave you all with that question. I know there were directions you wanted to go, but in terms of, I guess in terms of my agenda, I'm going to be really selfish here. I would like for you to think about the closing question I had. How do you think that changes agenda setting when the media environment has changed in that way? I'm okay starting off next time, just listening to you guys. Or if you want to email me your stuff, email me those ideas, then I can kind of rehash them and get started. Whatever you feel comfortable doing, but again, I really want to take advantage of all the information and expertise that's out there.
Great. Wonderful. Well, this was a nice, fun endeavor. Thank you so much. And we will be back. I sound like a host here. We'll be back next Wednesday. Same time, 8 p.m. Eastern, September 9th. So it's such a blessing. It truly is. And it just grows my love for St. Mary's even more. And it's such a gift to have you, Pat. So thank you for your time. And thanks, everyone. It's kind of awkward because I'm essentially going to hang up on you now. So
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Pat.
All right,
Take care.
bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Pat.